One of the fundamental axioms in some sense of a free market system is that the only way to properly compute the value of the emerging horizon of the future is by sampling and perhaps summing the free choice of a multitude of free agents. That's actually the only way you can do it. There is no central planning way, even in principle, that can substitute for that. We can't compute the future algorithmically from the past. And so we have to use mechanisms other than deterministic algorithm to plot our way forward. And part of the way we do that is by using the entire economic system as a massive computational device that uses the array of choices that everyone makes as the mechanism that values new things as they emerge. Now, central planning types, they think they can just jump over that and say, well, no, we need to save the planet, let's say. That's the ESG monsters are on beating that drum at the moment. And so they think they can subordinate that computational mechanism to some sort of ethical or procedural algorithm. And I think that's complete bloody nonsense. And worse than that, I think it's extremely dangerous, because I think all the evidence, especially from the 20th century, suggests very strongly that as soon as you subordinate free market mechanisms to central planning ethical dogmas, you catastrophically affect the economic system in a detrimental manner, but you destabilize the entire society and tilt it towards totalitarianism. And we haven't learned that yet, because there's always a new generation of people that think they're smart enough to plan the world. And Bitcoin, in principle, stops that from happening. I would be motivated to try to understand Bitcoin if I actually invested some money in it, because I do believe the proposition that you don't really make genuine decisions if you're sampling a domain unless you have skin in the game, to use another cliche. And so I was curious on that front. I was curious about the idea of a decentralized ledger of accounts, and then curious also about the notion of competitive currencies, because as someone who regards the free market as an existential necessity, the idea that alternative currencies might be produced that could give the fiat currencies a run for their money, so to speak, that seemed to me to be attractive. And then I was also attracted by the revolutionary element of the idea, which makes it not humble in some sense, which is one of the things that worries me, because it looks to me like if the Bitcoin theorists are correct, and Bitcoin does take priority over the other cryptocurrencies, which we don't know if that's the case, but it could be, that could take the monetary system permanently out of the hands of the political establishment, or the political system. Yeah, so that's not humble, but it's also, as a social scientist, that also worries me, because, when you do something complex, you think this is the problem with the central planning mentality. You have this notion about how the world might be a better place, and so you do something complex, like change the basis of the currency, and you think, well, here's a whole bunch of good things that'll happen because of that, and you might be right about that, but there's going to be an immense number of things that happen as well that you didn't predict at all, and you have zero idea and zero evidence about whether those things will be positive or negative. And so this experiment that you're all running, I'm running, all the people who are involved in the cryptocurrency world are running, is like, well, okay, we're going to take money out of the hands of politicians, but that also means out of our hands as voting agents, right? Because it's not just politicians, that's you guys too. We have no idea what would happen if money per se was actually decentralized. And we also don't know, like, if we manage that, let's say Bitcoin attains primacy, is it irreversible? Like, is that permanent? And then you think, well, what if it's a bad idea and it's irreversible? I'm not saying it is, and I'm not even saying I'm necessarily pessimistic about it, but the probability that you invent something extremely powerful and it only does the things you think it will do and all those things are good, it's like, no, that never happens. I don't think that's a particularly revolutionary observation on my part. That's the sort of thing that especially the real Bitcoin enthusiasts, the ones who are delving into the phenomenon from a philosophical or even a theological perspective, weirdly enough, are insisting, well, it's incorruptible because there is no central agent of control. I mean, I'm just bringing coals to Newcastle here. I mean, one of the things that all of you object to is the ability of central bankers to inflate the currency. And I do think you can make a pretty credible argument that you can interpret that as a form of theft. And I'm not saying it is, because that's complicated, right? I mean, in a free society like your society, and until recently mine, yeah, I wish that was funny. You know, the people who are managing the monetary supply are elected, and that means that we do have control over the process, or at least as much control as any of us have over any political processes, and we're going to take that away. Now, the argument is that, well, we should take that away because money's a ledger. You know, it's an exchange of labor. It's an exchange of productivity. It's an exchange of value. That's a better way of thinking about it. It's a way of tracking the exchange of value between individuals. And it isn't obvious that once you and I enter into a contract of value that a third party should be able to alter the means by which we track that exchange for their purposes, whatever those purposes are. And again, I think that's a rational argument, but that doesn't mean it's right. These are very, very complicated issues. I mean, most of us assume that taxation is acceptable, or at least we don't, strike up the revolution because it occurs. We seem to think that there is a role for government and for the determinations that government make outside the free market per se. Obviously, the government has to exercise some control over currency, over money, in order to make its functions possible. If we take the control of currency away from the government, we don't know what that'll do, for example, to taxation. If we could all of a sudden do all of our transactions in secrecy, like in real secrecy, well, we shifted away from the gold standard in the 70s, and, all hell hasn't broken loose. Now, I do accept the proposition that currencies have inflated, and perhaps in a counterproductive manner, but the last 60 years have been pretty damn productive economically, and so that system did work. Now, you could say, well, it could have worked better. It's like, yeah, maybe, but it certainly could have worked a hell of a lot worse. And so, well, this isn't a criticism of Bitcoin. It's just, I mean, I've watched over the years as social scientists have tried to mount large-scale social experiments with the best of intentions, and generally, almost invariably, that doesn't work.